In 1989, Dan Air flew 6.2 million passengers. It operated the second largest fleet of any British airline, behind only British Airways itself. 57 aircraft, 41 years of unbroken operation. Gatwick's biggest scheduled carrier. A household name. 3 years later it was sold for £1. Not £1 per share, not £1 per aircraft. £1 single pound sterling. The price of a bag of crisps for the whole thing. This is the story of how Britain's greatest independent airline was dismantled. Not by one bad decision, but by a system that was rigged against it from the very beginning. And by the time you reach the end of this, you'll understand something about British aviation that the official history has never quite said out loud. Let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. The 21st of May, 1953. A small London shipbroking firm called Davies and Newman has come into possession of an aging Douglas the 603, a Dakota, as settlement of a debt from a tiny operator called Meredith Air Transport. Fred Newman, the company's chairman, had no intention of running an airline. He was a shipbroker. He'd won a military cross in Burma in the war. Aeroplanes were not his concern, but the plane was there. The company had £5,000, and Newman, ever the pragmatist, decided to fly it. The name Dan Air came from the company's initials, Davies and Newman. Not the most poetic origin story. Not exactly the romance of aviation pioneers gazing at the sky. Just a man with a Dakota and an accountant's eye, deciding to make something useful of an asset. That first commercial flight went from Southend via Manchester to Shannon. Charter work. Freight run. Passenger charters for tour operators beginning to offer what the trade called inclusive tours. The package holiday. The sun. The med. The dream that ordinary British workers in the 1950s had never been able to afford. Dan Air smelled that market early. By 1960 they'd moved to Gatwick. By 1966, they'd acquired 2 second-hand de Havilland Comet 4S from BOAC, making them the second British independent airline to operate pure jet aircraft. And those Comets became everything. Dan Air would eventually own 49 Comets. 49 of the 114 ever built. At one point, every single airworthy civil Comet in the world wore Dan Air's livery. That is a remarkable sentence. They were the Comet airline. When people think of the Comet now, they think of Dan Air. By the mid-1970s, Dan Air had become Britain's largest independent airline in terms of both passengers and fleet size. They operated the country's largest charter fleet, more than 50 aircraft, over 3,000 employees. They flew holiday makers to Palma and Alicante and Corfu and Tenerife from airports across Britain, from Glasgow to Manchester, from Newcastle to Gatwick. If you took a package holiday in the 1970s, there is a very reasonable chance you flew on a Dan Air Comet. You would have settled into your seat, 5 abreast mind, and you would have looked out at the swept wings and thought, this is it, this is flying. And in 1983, Dan Air made history again. They became the first airline in the world to put the British Aerospace 146 regional jet into commercial service. First in the world, not first in Britain, first anywhere. By 1986, passenger numbers had surpassed 5.3 million. A record. The fleet included Boeing 727S, BAC-111s, a new Airbus A300 wide-body, Boeing 737S. The engineering division at Lasham was employing over 1,600 people, maintaining aircraft for Dan Air and for third-party operators across Europe. Dan Air wasn't just an airline, it was an institution. Then came 1989, the peak. 6.2 million passengers, 1.8 million of those on scheduled services, which was becoming an ever more important part of the business. And then, almost immediately, the fall. Something shifted in 1989, something quiet and structural and very nearly invisible, and it would take the airline 3 years to die from it. The man who built Dan Air was Frederick Edward Fry Newman, CBE, MC. He ran it for 37 years, from 1953 to 1990. He died in October 2012, aged 96. And it is important to understand Fred Newman before we understand what killed his airline. Newman was not an aviation man. He was a shipping man. He ran Dan Air the way a shipping firm runs a fleet, conservatively. Second-hand aircraft, bought cheaply, maintained well. No debt that couldn't be serviced. No expansion that outpaced the cash. This philosophy had served Dan Air brilliantly in the bad years. When Airline collapsed in 1974, stranding thousands of passengers abroad, Dan Air was there to buy up the wreckage cheaply. 4 BAC-111s, and carry on. When rivals overextended, Dan Air stayed cautious. But caution has a price. In the 1980s, the British aviation market was transforming. Thatcher's government was deregulating. The old duopoly, British Airways on one side, the independents fighting for scraps on the other, was being dismantled, at least in theory. New carriers were entering the scheduled services market. Dan Air saw this. They made a move. In the mid-1980s, they began converting into a scheduled airline. They launched two-class services on trunk routes. They added the Airbus A300 in 1986. They expanded scheduled services dramatically. And here is where the structural problem lived. The one that would eventually kill them. The tour operators. Thomson had Britannia Airways. Air Tours had its own fleet. The major package holiday companies had bought or created their own charter airlines. Dan Air had no tour operator behind it, which meant that as the major tour operators withdrew their business, Dan Air's charter revenue collapsed. Two transitions at once. Neither fully funded, and it was 1989, the year the music stopped. 1989 was the year Dan Air had a loss in all 12 calendar months, every single month, the first time in the airline's history. That year, they disposed of both their Airbus A300 wide-bodies, sold to recoup a half-year loss of £7.6 million. Two aircraft that had been an instant hit with holidaymakers, gone. The decision made financial sense. Immediate cash, reduced maintenance liability. And it worked, until it didn't. Then came the dominoes. First domino, Fred Newman himself. By 1990, the banks were losing confidence. Barings Bank and County NatWest were demanding that the board appoint independent external advisors. The press was running stories about the airline's financial difficulties. And the board brought in a man named David James. James was what the city called a company doctor. He was appointed chairman of Davies and Newman, replacing Fred Newman, the founder. Newman was out. James was in. Second domino. Air Europe's collapse, and what it cost. In March 1991, Air Europe failed. Its parent, ILG, collapsed with debts reported by The Guardian at approximately £500 million. Overnight, Air Europe's scheduled routes from Gatwick were vacant. Brussels, Oslo, Paris Charles de Gaulle, Manchester, and Dan Air, being Gatwick's next significant operator, began absorbing those routes. By the start of the 1991 to 1992 winter timetable, Dan Air was running 9 return flights per day on the Gatwick to Paris route. 8 daily returns to Manchester. More scheduled passengers than British Caledonian had ever carried in an entire year. Dan Air controlling 18% of all Gatwick slots and 21% of all peak time morning slots. This sounds like triumph. It was in fact a trap. The scheduled inventory was going to the same kind of bucket shop buyers who'd always bought charter seats. Lower yield, higher volume, wrong strategy for scheduled routes. And still, the airline carried on. Third domino, the fleet. Dan Air's fleet in 1991 was a maintenance engineer's nightmare. Boeing 727s, BAC-111s, Hawker Siddeley 748 turboprops for the oil support routes, Boeing 737-200, and the newer 300 and 400, BAE 146s, different engine types, different maintenance schedules, different spare parts. Each fleet type required its own trained mechanics, its own stockpiles, its own support structure. Think of it this way. Imagine trying to run a taxi company where half your cars are Ford Escorts, a quarter are Rover Metros, and the rest are a mix of a Range Rover, 2 Fiats, and something that used to belong to the Norwegian Air Force. Every service is different. Every breakdown is a unique emergency. The costs are not additive. They multiply. The decision had been taken to consolidate onto just 2 types, the Boeing 737 and the BAE 146. Sensible, long overdue, but it required selling the older aircraft at depressed prices in a depressed market, and the revenue from those sales was going straight to the banks. Dan Air Engineering, the maintenance arm, 1,600 employees at Lasham Airfield, one of the finest independent maintenance operations in Europe, was sold in 1991 to the Danish company FLS Aerospace. Another asset gone. The silverware, sold to pay the rent, and still the airline carried on. Fourth domino, the Gulf War. In January 1991, coalition forces began the air campaign against Iraq. Transatlantic flights saw passenger numbers fall by more than 40%. Travel fear was real, widespread, and economically devastating. The 1991 Gulf War cost the global airline industry billions. Pan Am and Eastern, two American giants, disappeared entirely in the same period. Dan Air, already hemorrhaging cash, now faced a market where passengers were simply not flying. They lost £35 million in 1991. Then, separately, the United Kingdom economy cratered. High interest rates. The Bank of England's base rate was 10% throughout 1992. House prices falling. Consumer confidence collapsing. The exact environment in which a deeply indebted airline had the least possible chance of survival. That's the system. Not bad luck. Not bad management alone. A system of compounding pressures, each one manageable in isolation, collectively terminal. Here is the question that the official narrative never quite answers. Why couldn't Dan Air simply fix it? They were Gatwick's largest short-haul scheduled operator. They had valuable routes. They had slots, landing slots at Gatwick, that were worth real money in the market. They had a loyal customer base. Passenger satisfaction was high. The staff were, by most accounts of former travelers, genuinely good at their jobs. So why did it all fall apart so completely and so fast? The answer is structural, and it comes in three parts. Part 1, the slot problem. Landing slots are not like seats on a train. You cannot create new ones. At a congested airport like Gatwick in 1992, a slot was worth enormous sums on the secondary market. Dan Air controlled, at its peak, 18% of all Gatwick slots. But those slots belonged to the airline as an entity. They weren't separable assets that Dan Air could sell off to raise cash while keeping the airline running. The moment the airline stopped operating, the slots were up for redistribution. They were the crown jewels that Dan Air couldn't unlock without destroying the business. British Airways understood this perfectly. Part 2, the tour operator problem. Airlines in the 1990s that survived were almost universally vertically integrated with a tour operator. Thomson had Britannia. Air Tours had its own aircraft. Thomas Cook had its own fleet. These operators could manage yields because they controlled the holiday product end to end. Dan Air had no such partner. It had spent 39 years as an independent airline serving tour operators as a supplier, never as an owner. When those operators developed their own fleets, Dan Air lost its clients and its leverage simultaneously. It was competing on someone else's terms. It's a bit like being a very good pub landlord who decides, without warning and with limited capital, to open a restaurant in the same premises. And then there's British Airways. BA had been privatized in February 1987. Thatcher's flagship privatization. BA had advantages that no independent could match. It had Heathrow. It had long-haul feeders. It had corporate contracts. It had the Concorde and the aura of the national carrier. Business travelers were choosing the airline with the gold and blue livery and the Heathrow lounge, not the one with the red and white lettering associated with package holidays to Benidorm. This was not stupidity. It was path dependency. 39 years of one business model, and not enough time or money to build a different one. British Airways, watching all of this from Heathrow, had every incentive to let the process complete. By the summer of 1992, David James was telling anyone who would listen that the airline expected to return to profit that year. 3 months later, he announced that Dan Air would run out of money by the third week of October. The summer season had been reasonable, but every penny of the summer's operating profit had gone directly to the banks in servicing the airline's debt. There was nothing left. Assets were sold in rapid succession. 2 BAE 146s, 6 HS 748 turboprops, then all of the BAC 111 aircraft at whatever price the market would bear. Everyone in the industry was watching Dan Air bleed. The debt had come down to approximately £22 million. The airline still had assets, but the confidence had gone. The press was running terminal headlines. Passengers were reading those headlines. An airline that passengers think is about to collapse does not attract new bookings. It attracts cancellations. The death spiral accelerates itself. A lifeline appeared briefly. Virgin Atlantic expressed interest. Richard Branson's airline, based at Gatwick, saw something Dan Air's management had failed to fully articulate. Virgin was willing to invest £10 million. The talks failed. Why exactly is not fully documented in the public record. With Virgin gone, there was one buyer left standing. British Airways. BA acquired Dan Air on the 8th of November, 1992. The price, £1. In exchange, British Airways assumed Dan Air's financial obligations of £50 million. For that pound, British Airways received 12 of Dan Air's most modern Boeing 737-300, the Gatwick routes, and the slots. Operations under the Dan Air name ceased on the 27th of November, 1992. The name was changed to British Airways European Operations. Of Dan Air's roughly 2,500 remaining employees, approximately 1,400 lost their jobs. Let that settle for a moment. 1,400 people, gone. The 930 survivors who were taken on by British Airways discovered, quickly, that they had not really been saved. They had been absorbed. The Dan Air culture, informal, direct, what regulars called a working-class airline with a working-class heart, was not what BA wanted. BA wanted the slots. The people were, in the most brutal corporate sense, incidental. A mechanic at Gatwick who had worked for Dan Air since the Comet days later told industry writers that on the first morning under British Airways management, the car park had different coloured zones. Dan Air staff were to park in a different area from BA staff. Small thing, clear message. So, who really killed Dan Air? The simple answer is, British Airways got £1 of something worth, conservatively, 50 million. And the question is whether that outcome was inevitable, engineered, or both. Let's be honest about the failures that were Dan Air's own. Fred Newman's caution left the airline without the kind of tour operator partnership that could have sustained its charter business through the structural shift in the 1980s. The fleet complexity was a problem that should have been addressed a decade earlier than it was. And the push into scheduled services was underfunded and strategically confused. Dan Air tried to sell scheduled seats like charter seats. That doesn't work. David James, the company doctor, had no aviation experience and operated with the confidence of a man who did not yet know what he did not know. He sold assets that generated short-term cash and long-term weakness. He made optimistic public statements 3 months before the money ran out. Those are real failures. Owned, named, documented. But the tour operators who built their own airlines and starved Dan Air of its charter revenue were acting entirely within the rules of the market. So was BA. But the outcome, one airline absorbing the slots, routes, and best aircraft of its main competitor for £1, while 1,400 people lost their jobs, raises a question that the Civil Aviation Authority never quite answered. The CAA's role in all of this was essentially passive. They watched, they reported, they referred. They did not act to protect competition at Gatwick, which after Dan Air's absorption became effectively a British Airways secondary hub. Here is the question that no public document has ever directly answered. When Virgin Atlantic's talks collapsed in October 1992, was that because the deal was genuinely unworkable, or because the pressure on Dan Air's banks made a quick BA deal more attractive? Branson has never publicly said precisely why the deal fell through. Neither has anyone from Lloyd's. The banks as ever said nothing at all. What we know is this. British Airways had been competing with Dan Air at Gatwick for years. After the acquisition, BA's Gatwick presence was dramatically strengthened. The competitor that had been the largest scheduled operator simply ceased to exist. Think of it in terms any British viewer will recognize. Imagine your local pub gets bought by a national chain for £1. The regulars lose their local, and the chain quietly doubles its presence in the high street. That's what happened at Gatwick. The pattern, by the way, is not unique to Dan Air. Court Line in 1974, Laker Airways in 1982, Air Europe in 1991, British Caledonian in 1987, one by one. Every serious British independent airline that threatened BA's position, gone. Some died of their own decisions. Some were pushed, most were both. And what does this mean now? Ryanair and EasyJet exist because someone in Brussels decided that Europe's skies needed genuine competition. The low-cost revolution was made possible because regulators finally understood what the previous 40 years had taught, that without structural protection for independent airlines, the market inevitably consolidates toward the dominant carrier. Dan Air's passengers, the ones who flew to Malaga on a package in 1978, the Newcastle businessman who took the Gatwick service to Paris in 1992, those passengers now have Ryanair, they have EasyJet, and they never knew how much Dan Air's failure contributed to making it happen. The question that British aviation regulators still haven't answered is this: how does a national carrier acquire its second largest Gatwick competitor for £1, and does anyone ask whether that outcome was really in the public interest? Nobody did in 1992. Nobody has formally reopened the question since. Dan Air didn't die because it was bad at flying. It died because it was good at competing. That last one. That's the one. Fred Newman, CBE, MC, died on the 19th of October 2012 at the age of 96. He outlived his airline by 20 years. He had time to watch Ryanair turn Stansted into a hub, watch EasyJet grow from nothing into a giant, watch British Airways merge with Iberia. He said very little about any of it publicly. He was a shipbroker after all. The sea doesn't complain. For this channel, I'm Gilberto Silva. Dan Air's last scheduled flight departed Gatwick on the 27th of November, 1992. British Airways had already repainted 12 of their Boeing 737s. The airport carried on, the slots filled. Nobody issued a formal apology, although in fairness, if they had, the queue for the apology desk at Gatwick would have taken about 45 minutes and involved 3 different numbered tickets. Some things never change.